Preservation Alliance of Evansville. The Preservation Alliance is an organization that we have worked hard to revive within the past year, and we recently put on the Preservation Awards, and we had a brunch, and we talked about what we think are the 10 most endangered buildings in Evansville. And I would like to recognize the board of the Preservation Alliance who have worked hard this year to revive that organization and put those events together. Would you all stand up that are the board members who are here? Thank you very, very much. One of the things that the Preservation Alliance does is host the Shepherd Lecture each year. And most of you probably know Randy Shepherd, who of course is formerly the Chief Justice of the Indiana Supreme Court. He's an Evansville guy. And his wife, Amy McDonald, was the preservation officer for the city of Evansville, while Randy was a judge here in Evansville. And they got married, and on their first anniversary, they set up the fund that pays for this lecture each year. We are able to have a preservation professional to travel to Evansville each year to present a lecture on a related topic. We've had a lot of really distinguished people who we've been able to bring here for that lecture, and it's been a delight to be able to work with those people. Tonight we have James Russiello is visiting here from New York City. James has kind of an impressive academic background. He has an undergraduate degree from Vassar University. It's in history, but also some art history and urban studies. Is that what you said? Then he has a master's degree in preservation from the University of Bath in the United Kingdom, which led to several previous employers in the United Kingdom working for various archaeological surveys in several places in the United Kingdom. He currently works for the City of New York's Landmarks Preservation Commission, and they are responsible for protecting architecturally, historically, and culturally significant buildings and sites in the city. Since the Landmarks Law was enacted in 1965, they've granted landmark status to more than 36,000 buildings and sites, including individual landmarks, interior landmarks, and scenic landmarks. He previously worked as a researcher and field recorder in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and England, and for the Victorian Society in America Summer Schools program in London, Newport, and Chicago, which is sort of the connection that we have. The Victorian Society in America schools, I went to the one in London, so did Dwayne, who's on our staff. James worked for them, but that organization, the Victorian Society, for many, many years was perpetuated by a lady that many of you may know that lived in Evansville, Gwen Cook. And she's who, James and I were talking last night, that she recruited him and she paid for him to go to the Victorian Society School in England. She did the same thing with me. She recruited me. I remember the day she came to the public library to ask me if I wanted to do that, and we both talked about how the opportunities that opened up for us and the things that changed for us because of that experience and the network of people that we now have. But that's kind of a local connection with Gwen Cook. He was a friend of Gwen Cook's for a long time. She spent a lot of time in New York, but all of these people that we've gotten to come here, they're a little bit curious about Gwen Cook and seeing what was her hometown. So I think there's a little bit of that with Richard and. So, I guess that's enough of me. Without further ado, I'm going to let James talk to you, and then when we're done, we're going to move the party over to the peephole, and we can maybe talk it more in depth, but over a beer.
Hey, thank you so much. Thank you especially to the Preservation Alliance of Evansville, the Reitz Home Museum, and Matthew Rowe, of course, for inviting me to speak to you. And thank you to Gwen, who I have long been very interested about Evansville because it's just been presented as the center of the universe. And I regret I'm only here for 4 days and I haven't even scratched the surface. There's just so many buildings to see. It has just been a wonderful, wonderful trip here. But my talk is about the adaptive reuse of churches. And for anybody, adaptive reuse is just a fancy term for a strategy found throughout the history of architecture. We're using costly structures almost always where reuse is cheaper and more practical than a new build. The history of architecture has been about new building, and reuse has always been marginalized, but reuse is all around us. We're in an adaptively reused carriage house. And Dwayne pointed out that these are the carriage stalls here, and yeah, I mean, it's charming. We're in a beautiful space, and you can appreciate the former use while you're putting it to new uses here. One of the quotes that's just kind of quickly here is Jane Jacobs in her great blockbuster book in the 1960s on the death and life of great American cities. She says, "Old life sometimes can use new buildings, but old ideas can use new buildings. New ideas must use old buildings." So the concept explains the general appeal of reuse, but is unconcerned with the building's fate, as new ideas sometimes fail or leave their vacated buildings worse for wear. And I'd be remiss if we were talking about religious structures, and we didn't bring up current events. The tragedy at Notre Dame, where thankfully nobody was hurt. But it immediately, while it was still in flames, architects started submitting proposals to adaptively reuse the structure. This is Sir Norman Foster. Possibly he didn't do it ironically. He likes to put glass on everything with the little tower and everything. And immediately people tweeted back kind of joke ideas. Let's turn Notre Dame into a Times Square type thing. Or let's just do a drop cork ceiling. And everybody was racing to kind of get in a quote, because this was a news story that was being followed throughout the world. I personally liked Vincent Dunn. He was our fire chief in our city. And he mentioned this thing. Houses of worship were built to burn. If they weren't houses of worship, they'd be condemned long ago. And that really kind of shows you that there's a special nature here. That special nature comes with exemptions. Whether it's tax exemptions, tax credits, or unfortunately sometimes looking the other way for code compliance, reuse may remove some of these exemptions. And with a church context, repeated change of use often undermines the authoritative character. So my talk is really about proposing a sympathetic planning hierarchy for the reuse of redundant churches appropriate to their architectural and community significance. By sustainable, I mean keeping the buildings secured and upright, which invariably means occupied. Sustainable reuse options depend on proactively addressing present and future reuses for redundancies and potential community needs appropriate to the church's evaluated significance. Through examples, I hope to show you that there's a hierarchy, repeated changes of use that often cause more damage to a structure than selecting an initially less sympathetic reuse in the search of a long-term tenant. Invariably, this leads us to need to define what a significant historic church is and isn't. And in this country, and I'm sorry to use this quote here, but oops, it's from Mike Huckabee back when he was running for president, and he was a Southern Baptist preacher, and so he was justifying his ability to separate church from state. And he just says, I didn't replace the dome of the Arkansas Capitol with a steeple, as if churches didn't have stones. So this is, in our minds, within the American context, the steeple is the unique traditional church architecture signifier of that building type. And whenever we see a steeple on a non-church, we think, oh, is that a reuse? So significant church buildings, church architecture is often best understood by investigating acknowledged present failings, such as the design reviled but congregationally popular modern American megachurch. This church in Houston is in a former sports stadium. This is what we're going for. It looks like a mall, a convention center, and it is going away from what our traditional concept of a church is. But more than any other building type, churches are, excuse me, sorry for that. These buildings often seat over 10,000 people. By the mid-1990s, megachurches accounted for only 2% of U.S. Protestants, but that figure itself is over a 4,000% increase. Megachurches stress function over worship, designing buildings that accommodate musicals, theater productions, potlucks, sporting events, education, rather than constructing beautiful, symbolful, worship-oriented sanctuaries. In contrast, significant church architecture often possesses wildly uneconomical design elements, such as pediments, towers, spires, with the common heat loss features such as double height interior spaces, exposed roof structures, thin leaded windows, stained glass, or uninsulated solid masonry walls. And you can see there's a lot of churches, historic churches, that do not have spires, domes, and these are all very significant buildings here. More than any other building type, churches are community landmarks serving as points of reference within the everyday environment by celebrating community and ritual in their architectural forms. Oftentimes they come with historic churchyards where the town is buried in, significant names are here, and whether we're churchgoers or not, everybody has likely attended a significant event within or with a church building as the background. Either for this reason alone, the building is given extra weight and significance. Within small and large communities, the often deliberate external distinctions that mark churches as landmarks are reinforced by their semi-public space, since churches frequently serve as a social hub. And I don't know if anybody are familiar with the Giambattista Noli's 1748 map of Rome, but it was revolutionary at the time because Rome in the 18th century was a one-denomination town, but he decided to depict the entire city at ground floor level. He blackened in all private spaces and he kept white all public spaces. That included the streets, the piazzas, the alleyways, the arcaded walkways, and the church interior. As you can see over here, this is the Pantheon. And it's just a wonderful map, and it shows you that the interiors of Rome's churches were as public as its exteriors. Whereas when we're dealing with a pluralistic religious society, churches are perceived as a little different than public space, and subsequently their community value is lessened, with protection of their external and internal features lessened as well. Thus, the registered significance of a church building depends often on the relationship with its community. Whether that public is also a congregation in a one-church town, or whether the non-worshippers appreciate internal and external differences, features that are accessible to them. How does the building sit in the built environment? Does the structure demand attention or blend? Does it erupt in the townscape with an authoritative spire? And if so, are there other spires that spire is in conversation with? With an array of function and forms that are meaningful, reuse affecting such authoritative church buildings must be well planned with the long-term considerations addressing community and reuse in terms of sustainability. And just a quick word on kind of the history of church forms, if I can. There's two earliest church forms were developed as the center and the path. Essentially kind of a round form and a long form. The center is more or less a congregational type space, so an auditorium for speaking, great for acoustics. Long form is more processional, nave, great for institutionalized ritual. And when we're dealing with kind of historic church architecture in America, we always go back to the Puritan meeting house example. This is the Pelham, Massachusetts Town Hall. It's the oldest continuously used town hall in the country. And you can see that the original structure here, it was built in the 1740s, of course, in the town common. It was really just in a plain, simple box. Double height space, they've now kind of closed it in a little bit. Later on, they added a porch as they kind of added embellishments to it. And in the US, the Puritans created kind of these simple, functional, barn-like preaching boxes, the meeting house, and it was implicitly defined that the church was not the building, but the congregation. As America diversified religiously, older denominations became more established, embellishments were added to meeting houses, and Puritan-derived churches competed with each other with ornament. And when I kind of go into terms of established, I'm talking about mainline denominations. I don't mean for this. This is just kind of a quick list. Lutherans, Presbyterians, Unitarians, Congregationals, Catholics, Episcopalians. Non-mainlines, we're typically talking about Seventh-day Adventists, Pentecostals. And this really has nothing to do with their religious beliefs or anything. It's more about how they were treated in the places that they came, what their place is with their buildings and everything else. So basically what we're talking about here is the general threats to churches these days are largely that every worship is undergoing a general sea change. Low religious attendance in historic churches, where congregations have often moved or disbanded, has created a visual heritage of empty buildings. More damaging to the public mindset of an abandoned or inappropriately reused church is the all too common sight of an underused, resource-consuming white elephant of a costly historic structure. The public's perception of a historic church is largely influenced by its accessibility. So these are churches in Bristol. Bristol was one of these great British cities. It was always England's second city, and it's one of these calendar church cities where they had a church, 365 churches. That's clearly too many churches for any town. all in one denomination. And they have a lot of these kind of closed churches which are too significant to do anything with, but they can't fill them. And as it's closed and waiting, you really are trying to figure out some type of use as more and more damage. You can see the graffiti, the ivy that's coming up that's destroying its walls is kind of happening here. And ultimately, this kind of comes into the idea of the Secretary of England's Royal Fine Arts Commission in the 70s asked, what kind of stewardship keeps an expensive building disused 95% of the week? And this has become known in church terms as kind of the 6-day monument. You open your church up, you want as many people to come, but only on Sunday for an hour or 2 hours or so. And meanwhile, it's closed to the public. And that's not out of some crazy notion of nobody should come in, but it's really who has the resources to keep it open, the insurance. If you are letting the building open, you should have somebody present to make sure nothing is stolen or nothing is damaged. This was often reiterated by another church commentator, Sir Roy Strong. Let the community in. Little case can be used in the 21st century for an expensive building to exist for a service once a week or a month lasting an hour. And simply put, access helps proselytizing. Okay, and we're aware the common causes of present church redundancies originate from the same problems: overbuilding, population shifts, social shifts, and ecumenicalism. So historic churches were optimistically built during the evangelizing period with unrealistic expectations. This is just a quick corner in Mount Pleasant in Washington, D.C. This was when I had a very poor camera. I'm driving through Palmyra, the birthplace of Mormonism, which was born out of somebody looking at all the different denominations and thinking which one is right. I didn't catch it, but there's a giant church on all corners. This is Main Street, and you go into pretty much every large town, and you're going to see 4 spires at their main street and their intersection. And in the 19th century, these churches were built to hold not just the entire town's population, but then some. And you have 4 of them. These are overly enthusiastic, and as population declines, social shifts, these things can't fill each other, and they all have very elaborate, expensive roof lines to maintain because they're trying to distinguish each other, and it just becomes this very costly maintenance. Post-war population shifts and urban renewal plans in the 1960s and 70s created a series of interruptions that drained involved congregants from historic churches who would have otherwise aided maintenance and non-worship activities. Faced with their own survival, particularly inner-city historic churches abandoned community outreach programs, resulting in the appearance of irrelevance. And it's sad. This is a Methodist church in downtown Kansas City. Obviously, it's still active, but completely closed except for the 2 hours on Sunday that it would be open. And you can see that slowly they're just out of safety. They have to kind of strip their ornament bit by bit, and there's nothing else going on. They're surrounded by buildings that, on the weekend, it's probably rather difficult to even get down here because it's all offices. There's no congregation here. This church down here, and excuse me, this is in Washington, D.C. This is where John Philip Sousa, the great conductor, was baptized. It was a Lutheran church here, and you can see it. This is a common site of downtown redeveloped districts in cities across the country where you were using eminent domain. This is all government office buildings. It's a few blocks away from the White House. And the reason why these churches are kind of stranded is because you couldn't use eminent domain to clear religious properties. You couldn't seize them, but you could kill off every single congregant's house. So now they're just isolated with nobody to take care of them. They're relying on people to drive in on Sundays, and sometimes that worked, sometimes they didn't. This church particularly was able to ally itself with the nearby music academy, and it has kind of more of a community center going on with a local community church there. Oftentimes, inner-city churches, this is one in London. London had far too many churches. Most of them were rebuilt after the Great Fire by Sir Christopher Wren. He didn't rebuild all of them, but he built quite a few. A number of these were destroyed during the Blitz, and it's frequent in the UK at least, when you go around and you see the church's name, you see other churches that it's become a United Benefice Parish. That means closed churches that are now having their service there as well. And it's almost like a grave marker. This particular church, St. Vitus Aelius Foster, is merged with 14 churches. That's astounding. I was like, this deserves a picture. I don't know. And just kind of in the general thing, is that 1957, church attendance really started leveling off and then began dropping. This included Catholicism, actually. Despite all of the immigrants, Catholic immigrants that were coming in, the older Catholic population stopped going into church. By 1968, 10 of the largest mainline Protestant churches all reported losses, whereas the Southern Baptist, Pentecostals, and Mormons and evangelicals increasingly were attending during that period. 2008 Pew Survey on Religion in America found that Protestants who had made up 2/3 of the population in the 70s and 80s made up only 51% in 2008, and nearly half of those were over the age of 51. With the goal of this talk is really to show the interests of buildings, is to put forward the interests of the buildings and not necessarily the religion, with the suggestion for appropriate reuse with limited negative impact. Thus, in dealing with one of the most common and recognizable of historic building types, a thematic crisis ensues that much of what we think is important is not. Critical to the need for advanced planning, determination of significance, and successful sympathetic use or reuse is a form and function understanding of the denominational history, liturgical requirements, and cultural atmosphere present in each church building. Achieving a sympathetic continued use requires planning ahead for the possibility of redundancy, not waiting for the threat to be fulfilled. The process between extracting the original congregation and potentially opening up a new site to the greater public involves a dangerous vacancy period. Instead of, and just kind of to point that out, oops, here we go. I'm sorry. So these are just two examples from New York, unfortunately. They were both landmarked very early, which is why they're still around. But typically what happens is, even if the community, the local denomination, the local congregation wants to keep the church, they're unable to fill the maintenance. And a deliberate effort is kind of to put in less maintenance as possible until they become structurally unsound. And then nostalgia aside, sorry, we can't do something. This is St. Monica's in the Bronx, closed, abandoned for 10 years, and then voila, it collapsed. Because it was a landmark, they were able to save the front facade. They were required to save the front facade and turn it into kind of a child care center later on. Norfolk Street Baptist Church, this is one of the great ones in the Lower East Side. Converted to Methodist early on, became one of the most significant Ashkenazi synagogues from the 1880s onwards, closed for a period of 10 years as the neighborhood became very hot, and then mysteriously burned a couple days after they applied for a demolition permit. And it wasn't deliberate. They caught the kid who was playing with matches, but that's what happens when you have an abandoned building that's very flammable, and these tragedies happen. So I just kind of, the issue is then, instead of reactive procedure to find reuse, proactive planning should be used to inclusive to the public, even if they've previously only been able to appreciate the exterior. Professionals and public should be consulted, and the larger community needs should be found. So sometimes complete redundancy must be based more on current denominational needs. It should be based on the significance, the qualities argued that make the historic church unique and worth keeping. Although functional design limits certain new uses, creative reuses excite new owners eager for a unique character. But demolition remains a valid recourse when a church is deemed not significant enough. And really the key is to keep the building in the public. So this is one of the Richard Upjohn churches in Maspeth, Queens. Maspeth now is an area in New York that has no landmarks whatsoever. This was the one remaining structure. Richard Upjohn is a very famous English-born architect who came over to the U.S. He was the man who founded the American Institute of Architects. And to be honest with you, his churches, while we'd always say they're significant, there's over 4,000 churches that are attributed to him. He published a book on country churches, and people just copied that. This building was in the midst of a demolition when the community rallied to save it. The land had already been sold, so they were able to take it down and put it in storage to move to a nearby area that also didn't have any landmarks. But that's much more expensive than actually just doing the repairs to the building as it is. And consequently, once something goes into storage and is outside the public view, it disappears. That is really kind of the goal here. And as contrary as it sounds, yes. So if anyone was there for, I'm sorry, yes. So I should just actually bring in first here, there's a hierarchy of reuse. Reuse can be as little as occupying the structure with the community activities when there's no such church services. The wide range of potential conversions can be non-invasive, invasive, with latter involving subdivisions, alterations, and extensions. There's no perfect tenant, but the goal should always be to find a long-term tenant in the space. And working to accommodate continued use or adaptive reuse should generally confer the conservation principles as conservatives found, minimal intervention, like-for-like repairs, and reversibility. These principles taken together are often yield contradictory results, but the most important part would be sympathetic reuse of the building to help curtail an adaptive reuse architect's over-enthusiastic agenda for change. The more publicly oriented uses, depending on the need saturation, are best reserved for the most outstanding architectural interiors or those of a significant interest. And there's just this list here that I compiled a long time ago here, and it basically just shows most significant exterior, most significant interior, or just historical, are best for keeping it in the public realm. So either that's religious, public-oriented, civic, cultural, and then by the time you get into more private uses of interior space where you have to cut it up, that's where you can sacrifice the interior in some ways. And so, continued ownership on principle assumes that the people who built, maintained, and historically attended the church are the best chance for that property to survive. These are people who are attached to plaques, dedicated windows, gravestones, and their ties to the church. So this church was part of the Preservation, the PAE's program on Saturday. Hopefully some of you went there. It was a great tour by Bill Burtett. Bill, the historian here. And it shows you kind of everything. And he was very proud. He kind of mentioned that this was, it's 1866. It kind of opened through, the building started in 1863. And he was mentioning, excluding Christmas Eve services, excluding the old evening services and the double services, it's had 8,000 services. But this is, again, the kind of the 6-day monument where, what else can be put in this building? And this is one of these great buildings that has an active church house with a lot of different reuses going on as well. But ultimately, this is a very costly building, and anything to keep the original congregation inside through community grants or national grants that add money through such as Partners for Sacred Space. They do grants and advise technical assistance. They're based in Philadelphia. This is the type of historical congregation, significant church that should be helped with any means necessary, helping with the roof or other things that would help the community keep it. Okay, so I'm sorry. Oftentimes, another way to keep an original congregation in a space is to dedicate that church to a specialized use. So this is London, Church of England. This is the old St. Lawrence Jewry, another Christopher Wren church. There's far too many Church of England churches in the city of London. So they were able, after this was restored and blitzed, they were able to dedicate it specially as a chapel to the nearby Guildhall. Oftentimes, neighborhoods have changed ethnic denominations and certain ethnic groups, and certain denominations which are multi-ethnic are able to more easily span those changes. So this was Rutgers Presbyterian Church, 1817, and now it's the first Chinese Presbyterian Church. It just kind of it's now Chinese services, and they have actually a Korean service as well. So they're always lending in. This is an old San Giuseppe in what was an extension of Little Italy in New York City, Catholic Church. And now, of course, it caters to the Chinese community as well. And it's the chapel for New York University. Frequently, it's great if the original denomination, this is St. Dunstan's in the west on Fleet Street, one of the most prominent streets in London. Very late Georgian Gothic church, just absolutely wonderful. It's an Episcopal church, but how many Episcopals are going to church in downtown London? So they're able to rent out their space to other congregations, other denominations. This one is a Romanian Orthodox church, and you can see by the attendance, they probably don't have enough for their own church building, and all they're doing is bringing in some icons and Otherwise, they're probably taking a time slot that's not as well valid, but they're paying rent and they're keeping this church, and it's a perfect use. Keep the building used as much as possible. Highly common, but arguably distracting, is mixed use within churches for non-worship activities. This is, again, St. George. This is one of the Nicholas Hawksmoor's 50 churches here. It was, for a long time, second or third most prominent church to get married in. Theodore Roosevelt, the president, was married here to his second wife, who was the first lady. And it's just an absolutely beautiful church. And you can see it's almost distracting to rent, to let. That's kind of how you say rentable space in the undercroft. And they put cafes and everything else in here. These are two more Nicholas Hawksmoor churches out in the East End. The East End during World War II was heavily blitzed, and so pretty much every historic church interior there was gutted completely. Churches typically survive because they would ventilate spaces, and they had these great, very thick walls to support their extra space, whereas the rest of the community wasn't. And when they were restoring these buildings, they decided not to go for the total interior, create a small worship area, and convert at least Christchurch Spitalfield into a nice community center. The graveyard was also damaged, but this is actually pretty common in inner cities, where they remove the gravestones, maybe they stack them along the side so if people have a connection, they can still look at them. And they kind of convert them into kind of a public space. So this one has a swing set. This church over here, St. George in the East, also in East London, that was turned into a Montessori school with an active worship church in the lower end. The most common thing if you tour around Europe is crypt commercialization. And it's a great use. A lot of people, these churches are often landmarks in their own way. They're tourist sites. And so what better way to do that is to put in a cafe or something like that in the basement. In the crypt, it's a nice special area that otherwise wouldn't be available to the public. And you put kind of postcards or something like a gift shop, and often tables and a little area to eat. This is kind of the best area to deal with because, I'm sorry. It's a distinctly separate space that doesn't have any need for pressing silence. The other thing that you get when you're kind of reusing churches for multiple uses is the historic seating. And there's a modern interdenominational consensus that appears to be pews are bad, chairs are good. And there's the Great Ecclesiastical Society, which has been around since Victorian times. They've been putting out this great journal, The Ecclesiologist. And when they did a special issue on pews, they had to break it into 5 volumes because so many people wrote into them. And everybody was against pews, and it's such a shame because they are a great piece of historic fabric. Medieval churches did not have seating. Seating was really introduced in the 16th century box pews, where you paid for your pew, paid for your seat that was kind of sealed off. Pews later came in the Victorian period. Sometimes they'd be free, sometimes you'd also pay for them. And now, when you're trying to do a mixed-use space, you're trying to be as vacant as possible. And you can see kind of these are some quick examples here, where you have seats kind of going everywhere, and maybe it's distracting, maybe it's not, but oftentimes it enables new functional uses. I just saw this article in the Philadelphia Inquirer last week, and it was showing this great historic church, and because they don't have pews anymore, they have this dance group that's meeting in there all the time. And you can see the chairs kind of stacked up next door. They're typically cheap plastic chairs, sometimes wood chairs. You always have to have them stacked because you have to be able to clear the space. Oftentimes, new churches have, even mainline denominations, have been adding in praise choirs, things with kind of a modern rock group to get younger people in. That equipment kind of stays there, even though it can be moved, or sometimes cushy chairs. One of the things, and there's two sides of the debate around chairs. Chairs allow for open plan for mixed use, worship comfort, and attract new income and interested persons. But chairs can firstly sacrifice a lot of historic fabric, increase fire hazard because of the new furnishings. A lot of people don't realize the #1 threat to historic church buildings is arson. All right? And one of the problems is when you do everything you're supposed to do, try to get the community in, try to get people in as much as possible, that's when the fires happen. And even when the church is watched, I remember Savannah Cathedral, Roman Catholic Cathedral, just finished a multi-million-dollar renovation. And it's a big church, it's a very nice, lovely historic building. And unfortunately, someone who had mental problems came in and started lighting the pew inscriptions. There were people on site, they tackled them, they got them out, they called the police immediately, but the fire damaged quite a bit. And so that's always the thing that you have with historic furnishings, and when you stack things, it just becomes this huge kindling area. Subdivisions. Okay, so this is a little bit more controversial, but sometimes you have to do it in terms of getting a new use into a space. This one is St. Bartholomew's the Great, and just historically, churches were subdivided. This is a very early church in London. This is it's considered the oldest church in London. And for a long time, these large churches that were there, that was originally attached to a monastery, became a parish church. It was cut up and divided into 3 houses, just this Lady Chapel area here. Those houses were later turned into factories and offices. And, of all the people, talk about, oh, this is horrible, we should just strip it out. One of the people who had their factory there, their printing press there, was Benjamin Franklin. He was there for quite a while. All right, up until the mid-19th century, there was a factory floor going right into the high altar. They had a 19th century architect, Sir Aston Wellock, who ended up designing Buckingham Palace that we know today. He stripped everything out, and you can see kind of the result, and it looks a lot like all the other buildings. There's nothing historic about this. This is a 19th century interpretation of what a medieval church would be, and it's kind of interesting. And he cleared it out. But this is a horizontal reuse of a secondary space in a church. Over here, this is